Well, thanks again so much for joining. We're going to cover the NEA Tools update. I'm Jessica Gronick, the GoSmart Program Manager, and yeah, let's hop right in. So before I even really get to the NEA Tools update, I realized let's do just a quick minute about what are the NEA tools in GoSmart. And before I even really get into that, let me just remind everybody that we're peers in the arts grant making space. And as such, we're beholden to the same final descriptive reporting or FDR reporting requirements of NASA and the NEA. And so we've long offered specific tools that help you gather the appropriate data from your applicants. And this update is just an improvement on those tools. And so those specific tools are the FDR data template, which is called NEA questions on the back end. That's getting that big update we'll talk about mostly. There's an activity locations page that really didn't have a need for any updating. So I won't discuss that today unless you have specific questions about how that sort of comes into play, but that's still just another type of template you can use that will gather the appropriate data that you can send on to those organizations. And then there's the standardized NEA report, and that also got a little bit of an update, so we'll peek at that too. All right, so the agenda for today, we'll talk about what changed with that NEA page. We'll look at the admin view, the applicant view, the read-only view, so you can see what your panelists see. Or if you create those PDFs, you'll see what it looks like there. We'll talk about how you can use the NEA page, and then some specifics or some sort of side things actually, rather than specifics. We'll talk about how you can continue to use it with the project budget template or not, and how you can use it with the funded amount option on your grant manager dashboard. And then, of course, we'll talk about what changed with the NEA report. And that's mostly the a little bit of updating to the headers, and then the fact that it's available still in NEA codes as it always has been, but now it's also available in English text. So that's pretty exciting. All right, so what changed on the NEA page? Right now, we've moved to 3 sections, and what we're looking at over here on the right is the admin, is the admin view of that NEA questions template. And that's going to be split up into 3 sections now. We've got our profile data, we've got our demographic data, and we've got our financial data. There is also some language updates to this page. So where you might have seen certain questions being shown as something else with a different label before, we've tightened it up and really made it match what the NEA's language is like. And then the biggest thing we've really changed to this page, obviously, just from your first visual glance, is the settings. So right now you have so much more control over this page. You can determine when things are, when I say things, sorry, when fields are shown or hidden based on the display setting. You can determine if they're modifiable or read-only based on the editable setting. And then you could determine if they're required or not required based on that required setting. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into exactly how to use those, but I just want to move forward a little bit over here so that we can see what it looks like to the admin, which is what we just saw here, and then what it looks like to your applicants. So on your applicants page, they can see it injected into the application or the interim report or the final report or any combination thereof, just like always before. And it's always going to show up as a single page in that form. And now they're going to also see it sort of split up into this 3 sections. So they'll see their profile data, they'll see their demographic data, and then their financial data. And as always too, I'm sorry, I skipped over, you can always include that info instruction text up at the top too. So if you feel like they need a little bit more direction here, or maybe you feel like with the switch, you want to come in and maybe add some language to say, hey, we know this space changed, here's what to expect. But you really shouldn't feel like you have to do that. It's quite intuitive, hopefully. But they'll see those sections as well. And then depending on the settings you create on the back end, they would see the fields in the appropriate way. If you're showing that field, they'll of course see it. If you're letting them modify it, they'll of course be able to click in and type. And if you're requiring it, then they'll see that required label. Then we've got that third view, that PDF or HTML really view, and just want to show you that really quickly. I know that this might be a bit of a surprise. Usually the PDF and HTML view is very formatted such that you see the label, you see the response. And even if it's a table, you sort of see the fields on the left and then the responses on the right. This page, though, is really following the way that it shows in the read-write form. So they'll still, in this read-only form, see the 3 sections with the profile data, and that's going to pull in that applicant's profile data right from their profile. They'll see the applicant's responses to those fields in that section. And then again, just following that sort of same idea in the demographic section, you and your reviewers will see the question in bold, followed by the applicant's response, not in bold. So that still follows a little bit of the old formatting, but this just really incorporates the multi-column format that we wanted to pull in just to really make good use of the real estate of the page. And then they'll see the financial section as well. And this is a good example. We've actually hidden most of the financial fields because we're looking at the application. And so at this point, maybe you just want to say, hey, how much are you requesting? And so that might be the only appropriate field of the finances. So that is the only field that's going to show up to your applicants. And it's also the only field that's going to show up to your panelists or to you if you use this view often. So that's how the look is going to change a little bit. I do want to point out in this section and to your applicants as well, if you were to hide all, let's say, all 6 fields of the financial section still displays though as a box and with the label. So even if you said, you know what, we actually don't ask a thing about finances until the final report, but we do want to ask about the demographics, your applicants and you, when you look at this read-only form, are going to continue to see that box. Same thing here. If you just get rid of all the demographics because you're really just asking for profile data in the beginning, they're going to see sort of a blank demographics box, which could be fine. And again, if that's the way you go, you might want to just take the opportunity to fill in the info instruction section just to say something to the effect of like, that section is left blank purposely for now, whatever works for you and your applicants. All right. So let's head back to the grant admin portal and talk about how you can use this NEA page. So like we talked about, the biggest changes really is that you're going to be able to toggle off or on almost any of these fields. You'll notice that we did skip these first 7 or 8 fields from the profile data, even though the applicant is going to be able to see that up at the top of their page, they are going to be instructed to return to their edit profile section if they need to update any of those items. And that was just to really keep some continuity in the profile section. But what they can do if you turn on these fields and ask for them to be modified, they could give you their FEIN, SAM, UEI, and or DUNS information right here. And if they do modify it here, and it is also a field of their profile, that'll update on their profile right immediately. So that change happens instantaneously and everywhere. So that's nice. They shouldn't have to update these. I mean, if you're asking for it on the profile, it should be correct, but this just gives them a nice little way to do a second check. And then what is even more valuable of these fields is if you don't ask for these things on the profile, which is probably more likely, this is the appropriate place to ask for them. So they'll probably get here and just see blank fields. And then if they fill these in, it would show up on the profile if those questions were there, but they're probably not. So aside from those fields, you're going to see that you've really got all that control for each of those fields below. So let's take a peek and just talk really quickly about what it would mean to toggle some of these off or on. If we've got all 3 toggled on, what your applicants are going to see is basically what we've seen a lot of, where they're going to see the field, they're going to see that they can actually respond to it, and they're going to see the required label. If we were to turn off required, but leave on display and editable, they would basically see everything here except for required. So they'd still be able to respond to the question, but if they get to the end of the application or interim report or final report, whatever form they're working on, and this wasn't required, they would be able to submit without paying attention to that field. If you further turn off the editable and required, and you're just displaying something, what they're going to end up seeing is something that's a little bit more like a read-only field. So maybe later on, in fact, let me take you there now. If I showed you the interim report for this cycle and we went to that page, you might see that now that amount requested field is no longer modifiable. And you'd probably want to lock that down if you asked for that number in the application, because you don't really want that to be changing later. So if you set this in the interim report to displayed, but not modifiable, not required, they'd be able to see that number that they put in the application, but they won't be able to change it. Then lastly, you can imagine if you just toggle off display, it's going to turn everything off, and it's basically going to just hide that field from the applicant. So a good thing to remember, though, is that these settings are per form of the cycle. So when I say form, I'm talking about the application versus the interim report versus the final report. So if we head back to your cycle pages editor, where you've got all these pages coming together in your forms, we'll see that maybe for one of your cycles, you do want to include this in the application, you want to include it in the interim report, and you want to include it in the final report. That's totally fine. You can still determine in each form how do you want these questions to show up? So maybe when you add the NEA questions template to your application, you're just asking for a couple demographics questions. Maybe you're going to turn on those audience questions, but say in the info instruction section that these should just be estimates, and you're going to turn on that single grant amount requested. But then maybe once you get to the interim report, you want to ask a lot more questions as somebody's moving through. Then at the NEA final report, you probably want to turn everything on and just make sure that you're really gathering all of those points, and then you've covered all your bases for your FDR reporting. And on top of that, you can, as you always have been able to, use the pre-populate function. So if you do that, I'll just remind you what that looks like. If you pre-populate, let's say from the interim report to from the application, and that's basically what you're telling the system if you check this box, you're basically saying when the applicant comes into their interim report, I want them to see what they told me in their application. But if you set those fields as modifiable, and just a reminder, modifiable is going to be editable back here, they'll be able to override what they put in the application. So a lot of this stuff really shouldn't change much from the application, especially when it's to do with disciplines, but maybe they gave you some numbers for audience estimates in the application. And now they want to say, you know what, as we're getting closer to the project, we actually know these are going to be a little different. So maybe they're going to change these. If they override something from the application and save, you will still absolutely retain those responses from the application. So you'd be able to go back a year or two or 10 years from now and still be able to see, well, in the application, they thought they'd have 0. But then by the time they got to the interim report, they actually increased their children and youth engaged. And you can see that difference when you pull perhaps like a custom report. Same thing here. They can totally modify their choices down here if you set the field in the interim report such that they can update. And then finally, from the interim report to the final report, you might want to pre-populate as well. And so to do that, again, you would just sort of check that box. And then when they get to the final report, they'll see their responses from the interim report. And again, can override it if you give them that opportunity. But there may be a field or 2 or 5 that you do want to lock down. Maybe you want to say, I want to pre-populate this, but I don't want anybody changing their response for their FEIN or SAM or DUNS because they should have given it to us sooner, and we don't want them to change that. That's probably unlikely that you'd want to be that strict, because at the end of the day, you just want the right number. But if there was something that you wanted to lock down, you could certainly do that by just turning off editable. And then again, those overridden numbers would still be retained from the form before. So if they change something from the interim report in the final report, you'd still be able to see that number they gave you in the interim report, or that response from the interim report. This all holds true as well, even if you don't have an interim report. So let's say you don't do an interim report, but you do have an NEA page in your application and your final report, same thing holds. If you want to pre-populate from the app to the final report, you would check that box. If you don't, you would just want to leave that unchecked. And really all that means is that when they get to this page in the final report, it's just going to be a blank page like it was when they first got to the application. And they would just sort of be giving you all brand new data. All right. So as I said, this page could or might not work with the project budget template anymore. We've always tried to instruct everybody in the past to use the NEA questions and the project budget template in that final report in order for you to grab those couple budgetary numbers that the FDRs require. So they want to see a total expense, a total income, and a total in-kind budget number for that project. And in the past, you could only pull that into the NEA report if you also included the project budget. But just a reminder that project budget is a little bit more itemized. So you're asking for things like earned income, contributed, some artistic fees, things like space rental, marketing. And so if you want to get some of that itemized stuff, you're absolutely still completely welcome to use this page if it's been valuable for you in the past. If you do continue to use this page, the NEA report is smart enough to say, hey, this page is the first place we go to look. And so if this page exists in the final report, it's going to continue to pull those totals into that NEA report. But if you were only using this budget template because you wanted to grab those couple budgetary numbers, but you actually don't really care that much about the itemized stuff, or that's not the way you want to ask for it, you can now totally alleviate that page. And then when you include the NEA report, or sorry, the NEA questions in your final report, you can now turn on those total budgetary fields and just ask for those numbers there. Now, you may find that you still have to sort of guide your applicants on how they're getting to those total numbers. You may create your own budget table where you ask for your own itemized stuff and you want the totals to match that table. If that's the case, again, you just want to sort of use that info instruction section to just guide them to do that, to say, hey, the page before we've asked you to give us a lot of budget information. Make sure that the 3 numbers that you enter below really match the totals that you came to on the tables we provided elsewhere. But again, it just really gives you a lot of autonomy to say, you know, this is exactly how we want to use this. And as long as you ask for these fields on that final report, now you're grabbing all of the budgetary data that the NEA is asking for. All right. There also is this one field, the grant award, and this speaks to your grant manager dashboard. So everybody uses the system differently. It may be that when you move people to funded, you're actually not using the system to record how much they're getting awarded because maybe you do that elsewhere. I would recommend, though, moving forward, that you really take advantage. If you include that number, let's say when you go to move somebody funded and you are given this field that typically starts with a blank field, if you use this field, actually enter the appropriate number and you save it and you close that window and you update, that number is going to get pulled into this page as well. Your applicant is going to see it again as that sort of read-only field, their awarded amount field, but it's also going to get pulled into that NEA report. And again, that's a data point that the NEA and NASA want to see. So I'd recommend definitely taking advantage. If you don't use your grant manager dashboard to fill that out, this is the one field that does not ever allow the applicant to provide that number. And it was really just for just to make sure that that data point was accurate and it wasn't sort of what the applicant wanted or wished they'd gotten, but it's just always definitely managed by you. So again, I'd really recommend utilizing that function on the grant manager dashboard just so that you can be sure you're grabbing that number. If there's a situation where you do want to use the grant manager dashboard to record that, but you perhaps don't want them to see the award amount, I don't know what that situation would be, but if it was the case, you could always hide this field. That way you're still utilizing the field on the back end. You're still going to be able to pull that number into the NEA report, but you may not be showing this to your applicant if that feels like the right way to go. All right. Okay, so those are the biggest changes with the page. Are there any questions there with sort of what to expect your applicants to be seeing, how to utilize any of those settings on the back end? Great, and if you have questions too, you can throw them in the chat or you can hold them. We're still going to talk about the NEA report, but if something comes up, let me know. All right, so now as I talked about, we've got that other big update to a tool here, and that's going to be the NEA report. And that's found under your reports heading. So usually you're probably most familiar with the custom report builder. That's how you pull all the data from the system. That's how you'd pull each of the iterations of your NEA page if you use it in more than one form. So if you want to see the responses to the NEA page and the application and the interim report and the final report, you would want to pull that custom report and just include those NEA pages there. But the NEA report that's listed down below is the one that's going to pull exactly and only those 28 data points that you want to provide to NASA and the NEA. And so you'll head here, just like every other thing in the system, you're going to tell the system which program and cycle you're working with. You're going to grab your statuses. Most of the time, it's probably going to be final report received because this is the most valuable at the end of your seasons. But once you've grabbed that, you can now select NEA codes, which is going to give you very similar to what you've gotten in the past, which is going to be just that that report that's going to show up with that NEA coding. So again, you know, all those responses are already coded on the back end. This is probably something like music, opera. This might be students or in the schools, whatever it is. We can certainly provide a cheat sheet, but we're just pulling it straight from the NEA as well. And so this just matches their coding. And that way, when you provide this to them, your work is already done. But we've heard in the past that it would be really beneficial for you and your internal teams to be able to see the actual English responses here so that you could actually see, hey, how many opera musicians are in our group? How many people are working with the elderly, et cetera. And so now you can actually build a new report with the general details, and that's going to give you that English language response. And so, whoops, let me head back and grab an appropriate status. can give you a peek at what that would look like. So rather than those codes, now we're actually seeing dance, ballet, theater, mime, learning, things like that. All of those English language responses. So hopefully that'll be really beneficial, again, as you're really telling your story. So you can say, here's the folks who we are working with the most. All right. So let's talk about some use cases to consider. And this might be a little bit of a repetition of some things I've said, but I did want to pull together maybe 4 or 5 specific types of ways that you might be changing the way you're using these pages, or you might start to incorporate these pages if you were never using them before. So just as we said before, the new function of this page is really meant to make your FDR data point gathering as streamlined and simple as possible. So some of our recommendations follow. So if you want to, let's say, gather the amount requested as a data point in the application, but nothing else, you want to say, hey, tell us how much you're requesting. And we want to be able to use that data point in our NEA report because it's a required data point, but we don't want to ask for anything else. Great, you can absolutely do that. If you want to, you would basically be adding the NEA page to your application, and you would basically just hide everything except for that grant amount requested. Now, again, that's going to show up perhaps a little bit unorthodox, and you would want to do a little bit of explaining to say, hey, here's why you're seeing what you're seeing below, but I promise it's going to save you time later. So you might want to say that, but basically what your folks are going to see is going to be just that whole page with basically some blanks and then the amount requested field. And so again, you might want to just take the opportunity to say something up here like, we get it, we see that there's some blank spaces here, don't worry about it, it'll make sense later, but please provide your amount requested below. And that way you've grabbed that number, and then you don't need to either ask for it after the fact. You can use this while you're actually determining your paneling and your budget, or I'm sorry, your grant awarding. So it could be really valuable for you, and this way you don't even have to worry about it later. Then, of course, you could go on and you would include the fuller page probably in your final report, if not even also your interim report. And then you'd start to turn on those fields. But this way, at least just in the application, you're just asking for that, and you're not getting into the deeper questions about demographics and audience size and things like that. So let's say you instead want to gather estimates or unchanging discipline and demographic data in the application or interim report. So again, you would still sort of start with what we've got here, but you would instead turn on a handful more of these. Let's say we still don't want to get into sort of this type of information yet. We'll worry about that at the final report. We maybe just want to talk about the engagement estimates. So we're just going to turn on those 3. And maybe we want to know their project descriptors. And still, we only really want to ask them for their grant amount requested. So if we turn on just those things and we say, tell us your estimates for audience engagement, then your applicant's going to see just a handful of more questions there. And whoops, as I changed those to display, I did not change them to editable. So we can see that I'd need to go back and fix that, because right now I'm actually unable to update those. So I would want to turn on these elements as well. And once I do that, now my applicants can actually give me those numbers. All right. Let's say you've done all that in the application and or the interim report, and you want to ask for those remaining data points in the final report. So just like you'd imagine, when you include this in your final report, regardless of your settings from your application and your interim report, you just want to make sure that your final report NEA page has everything turned on. And again, maybe we want to lock down grant amount requested because they've already given that to us. It shouldn't be changing. And the grant award came from you, shouldn't be changing. So we'll go ahead and update there. And then now when they get to their final report, they're going to see all 28 fields. And if you have pre-populated it from your interim report or your final report, they'll see those other responses. They can override them. They can answer questions that are just showing up for the first time that won't have any responses to them. And then when they save it, all of your 28 data points are going to be there. All right, then the last use case, and what would be our number one recommendation, but of course, please use the page however it's valuable for you, is that you only ask for these 28 data points one time at the end of the grant cycle. So if you're used to including this in the application and or the interim report and the final report, because of ways we have trained you in the past that you wanted to use in the application so that you could grab this amount requested, or because it seemed like a better way to grab those estimates, we would say, if you feel comfortable, scrap all that, just use it in the final report. Let your applicants answer these questions one time at the end of their cycle. And then again, you still have everything you need, and the burden is perhaps a little bit less because you're not asking them to continually answer these questions. And again, it's of course, I hate to say burden, it's however you need to run your workflow is the appropriate way to do it. But as we're all sort of thinking about making our grants a little bit more accessible, a little bit less onerous. This is just one way that you might be able to do that, where you could say, listen, we're actually just going to talk about this stuff one time, way at the end, and then we're all set. All right, so you've basically seen all of those updates. Are there any questions? And if you're shy, you can put them in the chat, or you can always email me later too.
Maybe I missed this, but how do people, if they notice any discrepancies in the profile data, how do they go about updating that?
Yep, for sure. So there's always going to be this hard-coded text right here that really just points them back to the edit profile. So if they read something here and they see that any of this is incorrect, they hopefully would read this, and it would say to update any of this data, you're going to visit the profile section. So they can at that time just head right back to their profile, update any of that information that's getting pulled in. And then as soon as they update and head back to that page, they're going to instantaneously see that update reflected there. Yep. Thanks, Natalie. Good question. Any other questions? Great. Well, thanks again so much for joining. And if you are watching this now or later when it comes up, when it's time to start building your cycles, and it's been a little bit of a while, hopefully this will help you out. There's also some tutorials that can always be found on the knowledge base. And so if you head there from your help desk, you'd be able to see under building grant applications, some NEA resources. And so if you head there, it'll just walk you through basically what we've talked about here. And of course, as always, reach out to me if you have any specific questions too. Thanks again for joining. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.